He's in person. Oh yeah, we're about to start, and we're in chapter 19 of Proverbs for people who have not been here in a while. We've been going through the last couple of weeks in Proverbs. We've been in this long section. These not long sections; they're 30 verses about each. 25 to 30 verses. I think today's are around 30, and they're basically sayings that don't necessarily connect with the lines before. So many people think that these are collections of sayings. Now there are some that kind of occasionally seem like they're contradictory, but for the most part, they're not. For the most part, they touch on similar themes. Sometimes they kind of say the same thing from another chapter. So they appear like maybe they were written by a different person and just had a similar idea. And they actually kind of touch on similar themes: relationships, uh, money, success, personal behavior. There's virtually nothing that we could say is a religious dictum in the sense that you have to do this, you should do this, you should make sacrifices, you need to keep Shabbat, you need to not eat, eat kosher food. None of that's in here. Nothing. Um, it's very much kind of a universal message of behavior. There are a couple of lines, famous lines even, we could say, that talk about fear of God, understanding kind of a higher power, but it sounds like that kind of stuff, like the AA 12 steps, having a higher power. It is a sense of humility, it's a sense of having fear of God, but it's not really, well, what is there's no deeper theology there. There's no, well, there's only one God, there's this, there's a God that, manifests in history, there's a God of freedom, all the things that we talk about in theology in Judaism. It's not there. Um, they find Proverbs in Dead Sea Scrolls. It's not a big part of Dead Sea Scrolls, by the way, maybe because it really doesn't touch on religious behavior, which they were interested. But there are some lines, not a lot, not a lot of Proverbs in there. And again, it could also be because this really did resonate more in a cosmopolitan city. Definitely, these lines seem to indicate that people are living in a city, seem to be involved in trade, commercial trade. They don't seem to be herds people, nomads. They don't seem to be people living in like tribal patriarchs, matriarchs. And there's a couple lines that kind of indicate that it's city time. Of course, we know, or at least we've talked about it. We're told that this is the work of Solomon, and so from the time when the Jewish people had created a kingdom, so there is a sense of a little bit. There's a couple lines about kings and rulers and kind of keeping society together, which indicates some kind of commercial system, some kind of hierarchical and kind of living in the cities, which was the agricultural revolution, the Bronze Age, people starting to become citified, which was a transition in humanity. It was not, and it didn't happen overnight, by the way. Obviously, it happened hundreds of years apart in different parts of the world, but in the Middle East, it indicates a certain time, a certain framework. Uh, there also seems to be, because of that, there seems to be this understanding about, even to some extent, which we read about last week, about marriage, which seems to indicate not a polygamous tribal kind of situation, which we know the patriarchs were engaged in. This one speaks about a wife, not wives. It doesn't talk about women in general. It really talks about a wife and the importance of a wife. And of course, we get to chapter 31 to Esha Chayil, to a woman of valor. We see how important a woman is in a house. Yeah. He had many wives, right? Oh, it seems like they're probably, again, from the time after the return from exile, so from 400 to maybe 200. Um, as I mentioned too, there's definitely a version in the Septuagint, which is slightly different than the one we have. Um, so it seems fairly close to the Septuagint, only from the standpoint of if there's two versions or a few versions of it, it seems like they hadn't quite decided on which version. And it's not like it's totally different. It's not like it's ridiculously different version of Proverbs, but it's different enough where people say, well, if you have multiple versions of something, maybe it hadn't quite found its final form yet, which is why you'll have a different version somewhere. So it's a pretty good indicator, actually, that it had not been put together or established as a text much before the Septuagint, which is again the second century. So that's one of the things we also kind of why we kind of date it like we don't know for sure. The language doesn't give it away. There's no references, historical references that we can date it from. There's no clues, but there are these kind of textual clues from the standpoint of the texts just don't seem that old. But as again going back to family stuff, yeah, one of the things that we read last week about marriage and about family structures, if you will, is that he who finds a wife has found happiness. It doesn't say wives; it says a wife, isha. It's a singular, and how important it is. And so we know that that's important. Now, of course, we also know that the man whose wife is not helpful is makes life hard. We actually read that as well, I think, last week. Um, so we have a we have a we have let me just look see if I find that line.
Hey,
I thought we
hey,
read it
Mark.
last week. Didn't we read it? We read it last week. Yeah, whatever. Um,
That. We did. I remember it.
I
basically
remember
said a
reading
man whose
this.
wife is not easy is,
Yeah.
it's
Something
it's
like,
it's a nightmare, which is true.
yeah.
Um, anyways, we'll find it. So,
Hey, Mark.
yes,
Vaguely connected. What did the Jewish people start educating their girls before, at the same time as the rest of the world?
it's difficult to know when women were educated. The fact that men were educated is already rare. So to say how educated women were, I look, when we get to the end of Proverbs and we read Eshet Chayil, you can decide how literate a woman had to be to be doing the things that she's described in there. You decide. I mean, we don't have a lot of other clues from it other than we by the Roman period, we know that women were educated executing contracts because we have some of the contracts. So we have them and we found them. They were found in a cave. We actually found at the time, they're dated not too far away from the Dead Sea Scrolls. We have letters written by women, contracts written by women. So 2,000 years ago, but is it 3,000 years ago? It's difficult to know.
Were they actually doing the writing or was a scribe doing the writing?
No, a scribe was doing the writing, but a scribe was doing the writing, executing the contract on behalf of the woman without a man. The
Right.
man wasn't
But
involved in the
that's a
contract.
different question than whether she can write herself,
Correct. I mean, from the standpoint of did people
which
have the
was like rare
capacity?
up until like the 18th century, even in our society, that women,
That's
they were
true.
taught to read, but they weren't necessarily taught to write.
No, but you look. I mean, the reality is, I think that I think that um, um, let me just say let me just see within this contract. So this contract is from this is the one of the texts that we found. We found it not far from the Dead Sea Scroll, where they were found. So we have the text from Babatha, and we found her archive, if you will, her documents, her safe. She had it with her because she was on the run, and this was during the times of the wars against the Romans. So we found some of her documents, right? The stuff that she carried with her, the stuff that she had to have, her wedding contract, her deeds. So one of the things we found was this contract. Let me just see. Yeah, she had a son, by the way, whose name was Jesus, which of course indicates that Jesus was not an uncommon name during that time. Um, so, yeah, the guy who wrote the documents were Eleazar, son of Eleazar, and Yochanan. Babatha herself was illiterate. It's described by Eleazar, who wrote that she does not know letters. So the fact that she did not know letters, right, and it's pointed out, indicates, of course, that she did not write the document. We know she didn't write the documents. Again, the documents attest to that. Now, if it says that, does that mean that we have to assume that every woman didn't write? Probably not, because there were men that didn't write, right? There were men that didn't write either. And maybe again, it's pointed out because there were many women who knew how to read and write. And so the fact that she didn't indicates that, again, she didn't necessarily have to read or write in order to do business, but she is definitely engaging in business. I'll just say one of the documents is let me just say one thing. So she was married. In 120, a legal document shows that Judah took a loan without interest from Babatha, showing that she had control of her money despite the union. The loan covered the gift Judah gave his daughter at her wedding, which she used as a dowry. Babatha seized his estates in Engedi as a guarantee against his debts. I mean, look, does a woman have to have that kind of does she have to read in order to do that kind of business? I guess not, but they're definitely engaged in business, right? So, and the fact that it says that she didn't have the ability to read, may indicate that other women did. Doesn't say like all women she didn't read. And interestingly, I wonder if she really didn't read. Like, I wonder if when they say that she doesn't do, you know, like maybe what they're talking about. Look, she knew enough about what documents that she carried them with her. So if she couldn't maybe execute documents, maybe she didn't write. But the issue, maybe like she's carrying documents around with her. Usually, if you carry documents around with her and you're carrying them, you give them to somebody knowing that, hey, look, this is my contract. This is my, this is my will. This is my. I mean, she must have known enough to know that these were her documents. But again, the fact that she doesn't write it out doesn't necessarily mean she didn't, couldn't read. Yeah. My guess is that there were different types of what we would call literacy in those days. And even up into the 1800s, as Rosemary's talking about. I think that there was probably people, the idea that like you either knew how to read or write or you didn't know how to read or write that's a false dichotomy. That some people could read but not write. Some people could read some things but not, harder things.
I have a sidebar. There's a book I just read called If All the Seas Were Ink about a woman who studies Talmud. It's very interesting.
Yeah, well, they're
Today, more
clearly,
women are
Talmud
doing that.
indicates that there are people who must have known Talmud well enough that they had to have read it. I mean, look, the problem, of course, is the Talmud was originally based on oral tradition, but as much as they say it's oral tradition, it's clearly not all oral tradition. The rabbis refer to the texts that they sometimes quote that were written down. So call it an oral law, but everyone knew that it had been written down. It just hadn't been codified. It seems as though it's virtually impossible for some of the women that are mentioned in the Talmud to be familiar with the text as well as they would have been if they couldn't read it, and in some cases maybe write it. Look, we don't know. And again, to Rosemary's point, we don't know how many people wrote. If they had scribes, and paid scribes, that seems to imply that there were people who had to do this work. But that doesn't mean that they didn't write at all. It also doesn't mean that they didn't read. And I think that that's, that's kind of, I mean, try to imagine for a second, if you don't know how to write, or you don't write, but you can read, all it essentially would have meant is you never sat down and practiced writing. Now, of course, we always do that. We practice reading and writing together. But just because you could read doesn't necessarily, maybe again in the ancient world, you didn't have access to papyrus and to script, you know, any kinds of scribal stuff. Doesn't necessarily mean you couldn't write or couldn't read. It just means you didn't practice it, or it wasn't most people didn't have access to it. I mean, kind of imagine if like only 10% or maybe 5% of the population had computers. Just because you didn't have a computer didn't mean that you couldn't read. Just because you didn't own a computer that's probably not even a good example because computers are so cheap. But if you can imagine a technology that you have access to, I can't even imagine. Everything is so cheap. I was going to say, imagine, you can,
Smartphones.
what?
What about smartphones?
Yeah, but everybody has them. I'm trying to think of something that we
But
don't
I
have.
bet not everybody does. I think everybody in your
I guess, but
purview does.
I'm just saying
By
there's
the time
almost
you pay
any
for a phone and
technology.
you pay for the service,
Yeah. But
but
I'm just
so
trying to think of a
imagine you,
technology that you and I
yeah.
don't have access to that some people do. I mean, we have virtual access. I don't know. There's not a good example anymore because we don't have them. But there was a long period of time when no one had books. They just couldn't afford books. They didn't have books. So the idea that, well, everyone didn't read doesn't mean that they couldn't read anything. It just meant they didn't have books and they didn't read a lot. But the fact that they
College
couldn't read
education.
anything, maybe they couldn't read well, but they could make out, what they needed to make out. I just think I think there must have been different levels of literacy that like it wasn't an all or nothing kind of situation. I think it's important to understand that if you don't have mandated literacy like we do today, and we have for generations in this country. But what was it like 100 years ago in this 150 years ago? I don't think there was an all or nothing situation with literacy. Anyways, so now it wasn't standardized, if you will, it wasn't tested for. So we're talking a little bit about families. Talking definitely the style of this is a father talking to a son. I pointed that out last week. The artwork that we oftentimes see for Proverbs is one generation talking to another generation. So this is definitely the style of this, is a parent or a teacher talking to the next generation. And let's dive into this a little bit and take a look at again, back to that question: did people read this or did people hear it? Uh, how was this kind of information passed down? Well, it was definitely passed down for thousands of years as Mishle, as the book of Proverbs. So let's take a look at chapter 19. Rosemary.
Better a poor man who lives blamelessly than one who speaks perversely and is a dullard. A person without knowledge is surely not good. He who moves hurriedly blunders. A man's folly subverts his way, and his heart rages against the Lord. Wealth makes many friends, but a poor man loses his last friend. A false witness will not go unpunished. He who testifies lies will not escape. Many court the favor of a great man, and all are the friends of a dispenser of gifts. All the brothers of a poor man despise him. How much more is he shunned by his friends? He who pursues words, they are of no avail. He who acquires wisdom is his own best friend. He preserves understanding and attains happiness. A false witness will not go unpunished. He who testifies falsely is doomed. Luxury is not fitting for a dullard, much less that a servant rule over princes. A man shows intelligence by his forbearance. It is his glory when he overlooks an offense. The rage of a king is like the roar of a lion. His favor is like dew upon the grass. A stupid son is a calamity to his father. The nagging of a wife is like the endless dripping of water.
That's the line. That's the line we hadn't gotten to yet. Yeah.
Property and riches are bequeathed by fathers, but an efficient wife comes from the Lord. Laziness induces sleep, and a negligent person will go hungry. He who has regard for his life pays regard to the commandments. He who is heedless of his ways will die. He who is generous to the poor makes a loan to the Lord. He will repay him his due. Discipline your son while there is hope, and do not set your heart on his destruction. A hot-tempered man incurs punishment. If you try to save him, you will only make it worse. Listen to advice and accept discipline in order that you may be wise in the end. Many designs are in a man's mind, but it is the Lord's plan that is accomplished. Greed is a reproach to a man. Better be poor than a liar. He who fears the Lord earns life. He shall abide in contentment, free from misfortune. The lazy man buries his hand in the bowl. He will not even bring it to his mouth. Beat the scoffer, and the simple will become clever. Reprove an intelligent man, and he gains knowledge. A son who causes shame and disgrace plunders his father, puts his mother to flight. My son, cease to stray from words of knowledge and receive discipline. A malicious witness scoffs at justice, and the speech of the wicked conceals mischief. Punishments are in store for scoffers, and blows for the backs of dullards.
Yep. So again, a lot of the words that we see here, scoffers, dullards, are words, conceal, lates, are words that we use for, and they even made it into Yiddish. The word let's is still used in Yiddish as a, dullard, fool. It's also not one writer, right? So these are collections. These are people. Yeah, the reason why they're in this order doesn't necessarily make sense. It's not. That's why we believe this is a collection of collections. There's multiple levels of collection that went on here to get us to this point. Definitely, you can see why this is like a parent speaking to a son, which is, you know, but also, again, we read last week, there's a multi-generational aspect to this, because if a father is telling this to his son, he's actually telling it also for the son to think about for the next generation. We actually read that great line last week that grandparents, have it's a special gift to be able to be a grandparent. How important that is. Again, but there does seem to be, if a father or a previous generation is telling his son, well, look, maybe again, this is why you were disciplined. By the way, the idea of discipline, there's the one line that we talked about, spare the rod, spoil the child. The translation of the reformat of that, there is definitely an understanding that there's corporal punishment is going on here, but it's not that we're encouraging you to hit somebody. As a matter of fact, the word discipline in Judaism, and again, to some extent, the word discipline by itself doesn't mean, like, when we say we're going to discipline somebody, we think of that, the connotation is we're going to beat somebody. But that's not really what the word discipline means, right? The discipline is when somebody takes it on themselves, when they're disciplined, and again, the whole concept of being a disciple, all of those, the origin of the word isn't that I have to discipline you by an external force in order for you to have discipline. We understand that. So when it says receive discipline, that doesn't mean, bend over, I'm going to start beating you. Receiving discipline is taking on your learning, taking on your understanding. Take this, take this stuff to heart and make it internal, right? And again, if you're smart, when somebody corrects you, you gain knowledge. Reprove an intelligent man, and he gains knowledge. This is not, an indication that you will be successful and that you will do better is if somebody can correct you and you don't freak out. So there's a two-way street. The first is, again, discipline doesn't mean I'm going to have to hit you in order for you to do the right thing. And the other thing is that if you're going to be successful, listen to what people are telling you when they're trying to help you, and sometimes trying to criticize you or tell you how you can do better. So, that's definitely a theme through this. Obviously there's so many other things here, but I mean, this is one of the things that you can hear throughout is, listen to what people are trying to tell you. Keep your mouth shut, which we're going to get to soon, and listen, and kind of learn from people who've been there before. Again, talking about laziness and people who aren't even getting out of bed. I don't necessarily see that as sign of depression, but definitely there's a difference with people who are just being lazy. And success, obviously, it's going to come to people who work hard, and it's fitting for people who work hard and who are successful. But again, not being successful leads to people not liking you. Now, that's not, hey, let's go out and make sure we're more successful than everybody so that people like us. But it's a truth that people, as it said, when people are successful, people come to them and try to court favor from them. They try to get close to people who have money. And when you're poor, even your own family hates you. Again, it's not, let's be rich so that people like us, because again, we also learn that people who give money to the poor, who give it to the poor, not loan it to the poor, but they give it to the poor, that's God. That money is paid for by God. He who is generous to the poor makes a loan to the Lord. God's got to repay it, not the people. Not the people, but God repays it. When it says he will repay him his due, it's that God will repay him. That's why, well, it's capitalized, but it's capitalized because it's also the beginning of the clause. But yeah, it's the understanding that he who makes, who's giving grace or giving things graciously to the poor, because the word chonen means to be gracious. They translate it as generous, but that's fine. It's God who will make them full, will make them whole, I should say. Because look at the word, yeshalem lo. God will make them shalom, make them complete. Well, what's the King James translation on that, by the way, Mary, for 17, curiously? Yeah. I mean, to make whole, yeshalem means to make them complete, to give them back what they gave. So it's God that makes them whole. It's not the person's not going to give them back money after they've loaned it to them. There definitely is an understanding in here, which we're about to read, that you should not, as well as, of course, many of these were reformulated by later people like Ben Franklin, and saying, neither a borrower nor a lender be. We have a version of that here, which we're about to get to. Any other lines that stand out in people's minds as we read through this? There's so many good ones in here, but I mean, I love this one too. We have lots of plans, right? But there's a plan that God has, right? It's the famous Yiddish version of that.
Man tracht, Gott lacht.
Gott lacht, yeah. Which is in a Yiddish format so much better. Man plans, man tracht, God lacht, right?
Yeah.
Man, it rhymes in Yiddish.
Mhm.
Men plan, God laughs. That's a great line. Works much better too as a rhyme, and it works because it's Yiddish and there's laughter in it. I love that. Uh, it's not that God does it, wickedly, but God goes, "You think that's what's going to happen? Wait, wait. Be prepared for what's really going to happen." Yeah, some of the stuff is for it's not foreseen in the sense that it has to, but there's stuff that's going to happen that's out of our control. We can plan, can also be translated as not that necessarily God's plan is, malicious or whatever, but there's stuff that's going to happen and we think it's not going to happen. We're not prepared for it. We're not expecting it. Um, the word accomplished is maybe not the best translation from it in the sense that like it's like God's plan. It's been established. I think that's probably what the King James has maybe in verse 21. God's plan is or God's design has been established. That shall stand. Well, that's the literal word. Takum means literally, kum means to stand, to get up. But we can say established or stands. That's the way it stands. But God's plan stands. Yep. Anything else? Anyone else likes anything? Any lines that stick with people, or they don't like what? By the way, I do want to tell you here. It does tell us to some extent, maybe that um, this line about disciplining your son, which again, that does seem to be, making sure he knows what to do, not necessarily just beating him, but um, guiding him. Yaser means to kind of put him on a straight path, maybe. Oh, what does the King James say for 18? Discipline? For verse 18? Chasten. Yeah, it's okay too. But it's the sex. It doesn't necessarily mean hit, you know. But straighten them out when there's still time. Yesh tikva. You know the word tikva. Tikva, the hope. When it can still make a difference. It seems to imply early on, Don't don't discipline them when it's too late. Do it when there's still time for them to hear that guidance and to hopefully take it to heart. But this last part is so interesting. Don't hope for his destruction. Now, it's an interesting line because I think what it's saying, I'm not positive, but I think that if you look at the Hebrew and maybe the intention, and I think what you don't you don't hope that your child fails and learns by being destroyed, right? Like sometimes people go, well, just gonna have to he's gonna have to lose everything, right? He's gonna have to hit rock bottom in order for him to get better. Not like I mean, sometimes you say that and you kind of, I don't want to say give up, but you're kind of just in that frame of mind. But it's actually telling us don't hope for that. Don't set your heart on as a translation, but don't, I mean, the real truth, the real translation of this is, what does the last part say, Mary? For his what? Crying? Hmm. No, actually, I like this translation better, which is that he's gone. Don't set your heart on his death. Don't set it, on his being done, like gone almost. Yeah, I don't. Yeah, they definitely. Well, let me just see the set your heart on his destruction. Pay attention to the. Oh, there it says, pay attention to his moaning. Um, it does seem to mean like I want him to learn by failing or being bad. Yeah.
The two translations are diametrically opposite there.
Well, yeah, that's why it's tough to translate.
Right.
Reverend Lynn, yeah, you were saying. Yeah, but it definitely says the L
Mm.
is don't. And so it could be understood. I mean, I think what they're kind of saying is, well, you could make the argument that what they're saying is never give up, right? Never give up completely. But the idea that you write him off and say he's done, he's dead to me, if you will. That's kind of the way I understand it, which is that it's not, it could be understood as let him learn by failing and then he's still going to be okay. It actually could be all the way to the point where it's just, he ain't mine anymore. When what? Yeah, but yeah, that's all part of like, we got to get to them when they're younger because if we don't, but I think the actual understanding, I mean, I think they're missing, I think some of the translations are missing the point of this, which is when it says, do not set your heart on his destruction, don't give up on him. Do the work when you can, but if you can't, don't give up on him and don't say he's done. And that's it. Like, I don't care. I tried to get through to him. I couldn't. So it's over. That's what I think it's saying, but which is not exactly the opposite. It's kind of like, well, we do what we can when we can, but if we can't, we also don't say, well, he just got to be destroyed. Because I think people instinctively say that. I think if they say, well, I couldn't get through to him, so he's just done. Well, you can't. I mean, you can't do that. I don't know. That's what I'm hoping. I'm hoping that that's what it's saying. Um, yeah, but there's definitely a feeling like, hey, there's a time when you can get through to people when they're younger, and it's harder when they're done. I mean, a hot-tempered man incurs punishment. If you try to save him, you'll only make it worse. I mean, yeah, there's a certain point where, and there's certain people that you're not gonna get through them, and it's just gonna it's gonna make things worse. These are true. Um, it's yeah. I mean, there's very few of these that I read and I go, yeah, that's not true. Most of this I read, I'm like, yeah, that's true. Or if it's not true, it should be true. Well, it's not only not earth shattering, it's important to know that we've been learning this for a long time. Look, I really like it. The word doesn't pop up a lot in the Bible. It really doesn't, but the theme is there, right? Yesh tikva, there is hope. Whenever you see that, you understand not every tradition, not every religion, not every understanding, even today, has the understanding that there's hope, that something can get changed. If everything is preordained, if everything is set, there's nothing you can do. There is no hope. The hope is that, and especially here, that there's something that can be done. That to me is this idea that I think is special, unique in Judaism, which is that this isn't the way it has to be. Well, I mean, I like to think so. I'd like to think there is, but look, I mean, if you live in a very kind of predestination faith, whatever, there's not a whole lot you can do. I mean, I guess you're hoping that it's God's will, but there's also like do something about it. Because think about it, it didn't just say just hope. It says do something, chasing him, help him. Put him on the right. It means you got to do something. It's not like it's going to just happen. The hope is also connected to doing something. That's the thing that I think is important. It's not just hope in the Lord. It's hope in your head, but also do something. That to me is what when I see that word in the Bible in particular, it I pay attention to it because it is not always it's not always there. It's not it's not a matter of just believing something, it's doing something about it, and it's trying to do something. Again, there's things that are out of our control. We read it in the next line virtually, which is you know there are a lot of designs in our head. By the way, that also can imply we're scheming too. We're scheming on things, which could also, it's not necessarily bad, but the word design, the way they translated it as design, implies that it may not be a good. It's not just good thoughts. Um, what does the King James have for verse 21? Many are the schemes or designs. Yeah, that's even worse. Many are the devices. I mean, that even has the word vice in it, right? The devising, it's not always bad, but the connotation becomes worse and worse when you get through those. So definitely, there's an understanding that there's stuff going on in our heads that we never should be doing. So, here's a real famous line. We're going to take a moment just to pause on this before we move on to the rest of chapter 20. This is an important one.
Wine is a scoffer, strong drink, a roisterer. He who is muddled by them will not grow wise.
Yeah. Now, this is a really important line because we don't have a lot of discussion, as you know, in the Bible, because you've read now 2/3 of the Bible if you've been with us, verse by verse. There is not a lot in the Bible about drinking alcohol. It's just not there. It's not. There's a lot of scenes where people are drinking, not a lot, but there are many. There are many scenes where people are drinking necessarily, they're drinking wine or they're it says that they're drinking. We kind of assume that it's wine. Here both are used. Wine and yain, which is wine, and then shachar, which is alcohol, usually translated as spirits. They translate it as strong drink. That's fine. It's liquor, it's spirit. It's something that's not wine. It's definitely alcoholic. And what's the answer here? It is going to have an effect, right? It's going to have an effect on you. Yes, he did. Father Mulcahy in an episode. Yeah. Um, Clearly, when he was drunk when he said it. Yeah, great character. Um, yeah. It doesn't lend itself to lo chacham, which is chacham, to be wise. They will not be wise. So there's an understanding here that, and by the way, there are no lines in the Bible that specifically, there are a couple in the Talmud, but not many either, about narcotics, about drugs. It's not clear in the Talmud when it talks about drugs, by the way, whether they're talking about medicinal drugs or hallucinogenic drugs. But there's not a lot of discussion about it. That doesn't mean it wasn't used. We, as a matter of fact, can almost guarantee that some psychedelics were being used in the biblical period because we found them. We found residue of them. Yeah, and and they're throughout the Middle East. So the question of the extent of the use of them is not known, but it was definitely used. Some parts of the Torah. Well, did people do that for their? Well, there's some people who believe for sure. It doesn't say. We don't know, but we do know that this line here has been used throughout history to kind of caution people about their use of alcohol. Again, it doesn't say don't drink. It doesn't say anywhere in the Bible you shall not drink. And again, in Latter-day Saint tradition, it became a commandment not to drink. It became a very important rule for the community not to drink. Obviously, in Islam, it became important. Islam, by the way, did not prohibit other drugs, the use of other drugs. So alcohol was forbidden, but that didn't stop the use. Yeah, but it didn't stop. Yeah, there's countries where you still to this day you can't. buy alcohol, or if you can only buy it in certain places. I mean, Saudi Arabia only allowed alcohol, for example, to be on U.S. bases. They were not allowed to be out. You could not drink off of the base. The Emirates, when they opened themselves up to tourism, obviously had started having bars and things like that, but they don't want to see Muslims be drinking there. Yeah, no, it's an important law. Drugs, on the other hand, narcotics, whatever you want to call them, marijuana, psychedelics, were not forbidden within Islam. Doesn't mean they were encouraged, but they weren't forbidden. So they were used and are used. And again, came out that, Syria has been exporting them throughout the Arab world. It was their main source of, seems like their main source of income for the last 10, 15 years was narcotics. Illegal, narcotics are illegal in most of the world. But look, what is it? What's the issue? It's going to affect your intelligence. It's going to muddle your intelligence. It's going to muddle your wisdom. I mean, it's going to confuse you, right? It's going to affect you, and you're not going to grow wise. Both things are said. That's why it says it's muddled by them, and which I think is a little. By the way, that's a play on the word, right? To say muddled by them, right? Because you muddle, stuff in, you make a mojito, you muddle the mint in there. So it's a play. That was a translational decision to do that. The word in Hebrew is shuga, which is obviously the origin of the root of the word meshuga. It means, you go a little nuts, you go a little crazy, a little off. So it does. Now the question is, again, how do you balance, drinking with your life? And it definitely is a caution. I mean, this is an important caution to, having a dependency and a frequent use of alcohol. So it's a recognition. I mean, it's a truth. Can't argue that. Nothing wrong about that. It's a truth. It's a statement.
And now they say it's connected to dementia also.
Well, as you heard, the Surgeon General wants to include a cancer warning. That came out this week, my friends.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So I don't know what's going to happen about it. It's definitely going to affect, the overall views of alcohol in our society. But yeah, I mean, there's a recognition that that's a consequence. But again, Judaism does not forbid drinking. It doesn't forbid any use of any drug or any drink, but there are consequences to it, and that's what we are left with. Personal responsibility.
Did the temperance movement use this?
Yes, but it had a difficulty because, again, they knew that the Bible didn't forbid alcohol, so they were careful about using the Bible. But there was the temperance movement, which a lot of people forget, was also the way that women were kind of first got some of the political power that allowed them to vote in this country, and in England too, if you remember from Mary Poppins. But there was a real problem with alcoholism in this country. Yeah. And in England, as Reverend Lynn was saying too, it was a big problem. And so it was cheap, and it was part of the culture. And so, we forget that there was, this was a big part of our country. And
safer than drinking water in a lot of places.
Yeah, but I also think that the more, when we were more English, that was a bigger issue. It's not that other countries didn't drink, but other cultures had different relationships with alcohol than the English-speaking countries, the England, Scotland, Ireland, those kinds of countries where most of the first white settlers came from. Once the country was met, once we met, more Italians and more Germans, and it's not like they didn't drink in those countries, but it was a different part. It wasn't the part of the culture. Going to bars wasn't part of the culture. Going to bars is not part of our culture, my friends. If you think that when we go to bars, that's our culture, it's not. If you don't understand what pub culture is in England, then in Ireland, Scotland, it's not the same. People go to a bar every day, every single day. It's a community activity. It's where people gather. It's where people talk about politics, talk about city. It's where they meet. It's not been the case in our country for a very, very long time. And the temperance movement, to some extent, was successful at breaking that up, because by the time that World War I was over and we were back to drinking again, our country had changed. Our country, the demographics of our country changed, and we started moving away from those types of those types of settings. And quite frankly, women had more power, and women were not going to allow that same kind of culture to start again. So I think women were successful at changing and people have written about it. It's not like I'm not sharing something new. Women were able to change the direction that this country went to. But I also think the demographics of our country did as well. And again, it was not the case in the Jewish community. It's not that Jews didn't drink. Jews had taverns, and many of the tavern owners, we mentioned this the other night in our Wednesday class, many of the tavern owners in the shtetls were Jewish. That's why you have the Fiddler on the Roof scene where the Gentiles and the Jews are both in the bar together, and they start dancing together. It doesn't mean that happened a lot. Probably it didn't happen a lot. And that scene was maybe kind of saying, like, maybe it did happen sometimes, and it was great when it happened. But Jews owned the taverns in some cases. They were the distillers. They were distillers in this country. They were the distillers in Canada. The Seagram's company was a Jewish family, and there's a lot of alcohol companies that were Jewish owned companies. But the tavern was not the place where Jews met. It wasn't the place where we did we would go there, but it was not our places of communal gathering. And I think in some cases, maybe some of the taverns that we ran them, but we maybe didn't hang out there. The taverns were not, maybe Gentiles came to the taverns and didn't expect to see many Jews in the taverns. I think that's also a possibility. In synagogue, they mentioned they would gather as a community in the synagogue, which was not called it was not called wasn't a place of prayer. It was a place of gathering. The word synagogue, the word ecclesia, and which is the Greek version of it, but the ecclesia, the synagogue, is a Beit Knesset. It's a place of gathering. Yeah, it was the in our word for a synagogue in Hebrew is a Beit Knesset, a place of Knesset, of gathering. We also call it Kehillah in Hebrew, a congregation, which is what the word Ecclesiastes meant. Kohelet is the translation of the word, the assembler, the person who assembles people. But it wasn't for prayer. I mean, we also call a synagogue a Beit Tefillah, a house of prayer, but that's not what we mainly called it. It was not said, they didn't say, let's go down to the Beit Tefillah. Let's go down to the house of prayer. They said, let's go to the Beit Knesset. Let's go down to the house of assembly. The house of assembly is where this stuff happened. It also happened to be the synagogue. It also happened to oftentimes be the place where they studied and where they learned and where they taught. But it wasn't necessarily like, that's not what they called it. It was mainly called a Beit Knesset, a place of assembly. That's the Knesset, right? The Knesset in Israel is called the Knesset because it's the assembly. That's what it means, parliament, but it means the assembly. Yeah, Knesset. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Because a church, yeah, but a church was really, yeah, I think some synagogues started behaving like churches because they wanted to have that high Christian kind of feeling when you went into a Wilshire Boulevard temple or a Temple Emmanuel in New York was you went into a place that looked like a church and felt like a church. But yeah, the synagogue initially was like, well, they just started praying. Well, what do you mean? Well, yeah, we're talking and they started praying. That happened all the time. It still happens. It still happens. You're like, well, you know, they just started. So people are still talking. Yeah. So yeah, we did not gather in bars. I mentioned this before. The name Shank in Hebrew, or Shankman, is a barkeeper. It's a bar. It's not super common name, but you've heard the name before. Shanker. Anytime you hear the word Shanker, that was somebody who in Yiddish. That was somebody who was a barkeep. That was somebody who ran a tavern. So yeah, Shankman, Shanker, Shank. Those are all people that were barkeepers. Um, yeah. Anyways, so yeah, but it doesn't help you get smarter. It's not something we encourage. So that's a little tangent on Jews and alcohol, if you will. Yeah, there you go. All right. Let's continue.
In winter, the lazy man.
Oh, wait, no.
I skipped
We're
one.
on the next one.
Sorry.
The terror. Sorry, the terror.
The terror of a king is like the roar of a lion. He who provokes his anger risks his life. It is honorable for a man to desist from strife, but every fool becomes embroiled. In winter, the lazy man does not plow. At harvest time, he seeks and finds nothing. The designs in a man's mind are deep waters, but a man of understanding can draw them out. He calls many a man his loyal friend, but who can find a faithful man? The righteous man lives blamelessly. Happy are his children who come after him. The king, seated on the throne of judgment, can win out all evil by his glance. Who can say, I have cleansed my heart, I am purged of my sin? False weights and false measures, both are an abomination to the Lord. A child may be dissembling in his behavior, even though his actions are blameless and proper. The ear that hears, the eye that sees, the Lord made them both. Do not love sleep, lest you become impoverished. Keep your eyes open, and you will have plenty of food. Bad, bad, says the buyer. But having moved off, he congratulates himself. Gold is plentiful, jewels abundant, but wise speech is a precious object. Seize his garment, for he stood surety for another. Take it as a pledge, for he stood surety for an unfamiliar woman. Bread gained by fraud may be tasty to a man, but later his mouth will be filled with gravel. Plans laid in council will succeed. Wage war with stratagems. He who gives away secrets is a base fellow. Do not take up with a garrulous man. One who reviles his father or mother, light will fail him when darkness comes. An estate acquired in haste at the outset will not be blessed in the end. Do not say, I will requite evil. Put your hope in the Lord, and he will deliver you. False weights are an abomination to the Lord. Dishonest scales are not right. A man's steps are decided by the Lord. You scroll. What does a man know about his own way? It is a snare for a man to pledge a sacred gift rashly and to give thought to his vows only after they have been made. A wise king winnows out the wicked and turns the wheel upon them. The life breath of a man is the lamp of the Lord, revealing all his inmost parts. Faithfulness and loyalty protect the king. He maintains his throne by faithfulness. The glory of youths is their strength. The majesty of old men is their gray hair. Bruises and wounds are repayment for evil, striking at one's inmost parts.
Wow. Now, the interesting thing, of course, as we said, these are definitely Um, these are definitely collections, right? They're not all written by the same person. And one of the things that's interesting about this too, as we're reading through this, um, is that a lot of the ones that we read in the last couple of chapters is, one line is good, one line is bad. In this, like the beginning of it starts that way. Um, it is honorable for a man to desist from strife, but every fool becomes embroiled. The good thing, the bad thing. In this chapter, a lot of them go through and they're the same. They're reinforced. The two lines are the same. They're not opposites. The righteous man lives blameless, be happy, or his children to come after him. Yeah, they go together. So it seems like this chapter, or this style, is different than the other style, which is here's the good side, there's the bad side. There's the bad side, here's the good side. These ones, they go together. And so they're different. They're not the same style. Um, there's some beautiful lines here and here, especially for those of us as we get older. We just read, the majesty of old men is their gray hair. There you go. That's your majesty, John. It's your majesty. It's your majesty. Yes. Any gray hair you have, as is that cane, that's your majesty. Just remember that. Why do you like 15? Yeah. Yep. We think about what's really valuable. Wise speech. Siftei da'at. Yeah. Yep. Yeah. Yeah. This idea of, we've also read it in previous chapters, that ethical business treat, I mean, again, there's no religious lines in this, but these ones are. And this is also, of course, in the Torah. You have to have, you have to have true weights. The Torah says this. This is literally, if you will, these are some of the few lines that we have in the Torah as commandments that are here. I mean, you could say honoring your father and mother kind of go throughout this text, but these are actual lines from the Bible, that we understand this to be. It's not just don't have false weights. They're an abomination. They're a toeva to God. That is biblical language, and I mean biblical by Deuteronomy language. When the Bible goes through toeva, the abominations, or in Leviticus, this is the kind of language that we talk about with. This is biblical language of biblical consequences. These are, and you don't have that a lot in in Proverbs. You don't have the word abomination a lot, which is a biblical, not just this isn't what you're supposed to do. This is an ethical behavior. This is literally a commandment and a prohibition in this case. This yeah. Yeah. Oh, well, we read flat out that if you testify in court, that's also in the Torah, right? It's one of the Ten Commandments, but it's also here. Yeah. No, but oh yeah, yeah. Not yeah. The sin of not testifying, of omitting things. Yeah. What? So well, the line Reverend Lynn's talking about, the king seated on the throne of judgment. Obviously, we think about that being God, right? But there seems to be an understanding that people can do this too when they're sitting on the throne of judgment, right? If they're just sitting on a throne, it don't mean nothing. But if they're on the throne, kisei din, means the throne of judgment, they're actually sitting with judgment, then they're, then they actually can do the job. But they have to be sitting on the throne of judgment. Yeah, yes, but but, but he has to be on the throne of judgment. He can't just be. Yeah, by winnowing out, by glance. Yeah, he can get it out just by looking at it. He'll get it out. Yeah. So again, does he look at the people and say, "Hey, that's wrong"? But the implication of this is that they don't even have to open their mouth. He could just look at them when he has good judgment. I mean, that's where you go, "Oh, he doesn't even need to hear from them in order to know who it is. He could just look at him and know." But if he's on the throne of judgment, right? It's not just he's just doing it. Well, no, the understanding is that they are doing judgment. It's not we're doing this because we're trying to expedite and trying to get as many cases heard today as possible, right? We're actually trying to do we're trying to do this right. Dean, the implication of Dean is this is judgment. Now, does this mean that means we're following the law? We're going to do it by law, not by what we want, not by giving somebody who we know the benefit of the doubt, not by giving a rich person the better access to getting a judgment, but that there's actually judgment that's actually being done legally according to the law. So the understanding that the throne of judgment is the way it's supposed to be done, but it means that you actually have to have the law. I wouldn't say judgment. Judgment seems to mean like, well, I judge that to be the truth. It's being done according to the dean, according to the law. The law is being followed. And if the law is being followed, it can be done just by literally looking at them. There doesn't have to be a whole lot of, I mean, the implication again is that it can just be done almost by looking, which is it should be easy. It's not, obviously, but it should be. By the way, look at this next line. I've cleansed my heart. Who can say that, right? You can't say that. Nobody's been purged of sin. Nobody's pure. It's a beautiful line, but it's not my favorite line. My favorite line in all of Proverbs, I already shared this, and I mentioned that this is up in the cemetery at Mount Sinai, over Forest Lawn, Mount Sinai. Just this first part, just these 4 lines. And I talked about this already because we talked about the neshama. We talked about this, I think, actually on Wednesday. Ner Adonai Nishmat Adam. But I've mentioned it before. The word neshama is the soul or the spirit, right? It's the highest level of our holy essence, if you will. We talked about the ruach, the spirit, the nefesh, which is a more baseline kind of in between, maybe, if you will, spirit. But the highest is the neshama. That's the divine spark inside of us. And it literally uses that imagery here. Ner Adonai, the light of God, the candle of God, the flame of God is the neshama of Adam. However you want to translate that. I mean, it's those 4 words in Hebrew are so beautiful. God's candle, God's light, God's spark, the light of God is your spirit. Now, the second part of it implies that spirit is really the light that illuminates everything inside of us. Inside of us, right? Internally, that spark, that light can illuminate everything inside of us. So the secrets within us are actually illuminated by God. But, I mean, that's the second part of it. They don't use that part at the cemetery because the first part of it means that spark, that part of our essence, if you will, our neshama, is divine. It's the candle of God. So does that light, again, is that always a part of it? Doesn't say, does it return to God? Is it always part of God? It's always been part of God. It's eternal. It's part of Adonai. And it's inside of us. It's what makes us, again, human, but it also means that we're divine. We're part of the divine because that's the part of God that's in us. Now, what do we do with that light, right? Do we nurture that light? Do we keep that light burning bigger than it should be or it needs to be because we know we need it? Or do we diminish it within us? There's an idea in Judaism that, right, every day we open the day by saying, Elohai neshama shenatata bi tahorahi. God, the spirit, the soul, the neshama that you gave me is pure. Neshama tahora, it's holy. And you gave it, and it's inside me. It's part of me. And we're supposed to begin every day with that. That part is holy, by the way, which is interesting because, or at least it is in the prayer. But look at the implication of this. This is God's flame inside of us. Yeah. Now, we may not be. our Going back to this line here, our lev may not be purged, right? Our lev is human, right? Our mind, heart, however you want to translate the word lev, our heart is not pure, but our neshama is pure. So how much of our neshama is in us is taking over our behavior, taking over our lives, right? So if it's more of our heart, it's more of our mind, then it's probably not pure. It's definitely not pure. It's definitely not purged. It's definitely not cleansed, completely cleansed. And that's why the idea that we have in Judaism about what happens after we die is all based around this concept. It's all based on that, which is why it's so appropriate universally, Reform, Orthodox, Conservative, Reconstructionist, whatever spiritual tendency somebody has, why that's so appropriate to have in a cemetery. You know, I always like to look at it at some point because I'm not there all the time. I'm at Eden more than I'm at Mount Sinai. But when I see that at Mount Sinai, which I have to be on the other side, I can't be on the podium. But if I come out and remind myself of that, look up at that at some point, you think about that. What it leads Jewish views of the afterlife to be is that when we die, that neshama continues, right? That neshama never ends. And so how much of it is attached to who we are kind of implies that we go through a purge after we die for people who believe that there is some part of us that continues on. The parts of us that need to be purged are the parts that aren't neshama. So what we try to do is be as much neshama as possible. We try to attach ourselves to the divine spark as much as possible, make that most of what we are, so that the part of us that's grounded in less important stuff, let's put it that way. I won't say evil stuff, but stuff that is not the real stuff. That stuff gets burned off after we die. And the interesting thing is that that's why when the Jewish version of hell, if you will, it's not, for most people, unless they're really, really not good people, that stuff gets burnt off after we die. When we die, we go through a purge. We call that Gehenna. And the purging of that, the purgatory that exists, as some people call it, the purgatory is that stuff has to get drained away or burned off. It's going to leave us because we don't have that in the next existence. The problem is the more of your consciousness that's attached to that, the harder it is. Because if your whole life is on stuff that isn't important, that isn't neshama related, it means that you're going to go through a horrible separation from that stuff because that's what you were. But if you're more neshama, then when you die, you won't have to, it doesn't hurt. Like if you're more of a true tzaddik, if you're a true righteous person, then when your neshama goes into the next world, it's mostly what you did in this world. You know, stuff that if it's all attached to bad stuff in this world, that stuff gets all burned away. It's not going to the next existence.
Doesn't that sound very Catholic?
What?
Well, it sounds Catholic from the standpoint of there's a purgatory, but it was a Jewish idea first, which is there is a purging that goes through a burning away of the evil or the non holy parts of your body or your essence. I don't say body, your essence, your corporal existence, if you will. Yeah, but you could also say it never stopped. Like the idea of returning to God implies that it's not part of God now. The understanding in Judaism really is to say that there's a continuity. It's a part of us that's eternal. It's a part of God that never was not part of God. So returning implies that it's not part of God now. The interesting thing is what are you doing with that spark? This is real important. And again, it's talked about more in Hasidic Judaism in some cases. In some cases, it's not. But it's supposed to be. It's supposed to be talked about. And again, it does get enhanced in some forms and again, to some extent, I would say neo-Hasidism and New Age Judaism, which is really focusing back on this. Now, the question again is like how look, one of the reasons why Hasidic Judaism got more observant, and I say observant, not more religious, but more Torah observant, was because Hasidism before World War II had gotten to the point in some cases where people were saying, look, you're not really being Torah observant. You're really not following the commandments or not focusing on the commandments as much. You're telling people that all they have to do is be good and be holy, but you're not really giving anybody guidance for that. The Holocaust changed that dynamic by saying, look, everyone who's not following the Torah anymore, you asked for this to happen. Why? Because every time Jews give up the tradition, God comes around and punishes us. You asked for it. And so what the Holocaust did is it proved to the more observant people, that's what you get for not keeping the Torah. You get a Holocaust. So it's part of a cycle of behavior where, again,
really?
what becomes the focus is, well, you're not telling people to keep the Torah. You're just telling people that they should act holy and be holy. But you're not giving them any guidance for that. And that's kind of where you have this challenge within the Hasidic world was, are we going to teach this Hasidic teachings about like this divine spark, this pintala, this divine energy that we have, or are we going to tell people that they only get that work is if they also follow the commandments? Look, one of the reasons why the Kabbalah Center got so big was because they were teaching these teachings, which are nice spiritual teachings to people, but they weren't teaching them that they have to keep Shabbos and that they have to keep the Torah and all the other mitzvot. They didn't. So people said, "Oh, look how much everyone loves it. It's all new agey, whatever." Of course, but that's where you have a challenge within the Jewish community of whether people say, "Yeah, but if you don't teach people that they have to keep Jewish tradition, then you're inviting destruction." But these lines, which I think again are universal lines, that this is not, there's not a, hey, you have to do X, Y, and Z in order to be part of this. If you understand and go around telling people and treat people like they have a divine spark in them, that you have a divine spark and they have a divine spark, if you look at them and understand that they have a part of God within them, their essence, their neshama is divine, it definitely affects the way you look at them. It's much harder to kill somebody if you understand that there's a divine spark within them that as a consequence, if that divine spark is extinguished, changes your ability to hate somebody. So, anyways, it's also, again, an idea that, we've been dealing with and people have been thinking about since they went back to Gnostic spirituality and spirituality that existed from however old this is. But those four lines, those four words from that line, 1927 or 2027, so take that with you. You look like you're on your way out, Reverend Lynn. All right. Well, just remember, keep your divine spark shining, which is definitely a big part of what you've been doing.
Bye, Reverend Lynn. We love you.
Feel better.
Bye.
So when we think about these lines again, the ones that stand out, just keep in mind that that's one of the ones that we should carry with us every day. And again, the second part of it too, which is that it helps illuminate who we really are. Hadre baten is our innermost. Literally, beten, by the way, is your gut, is your stomach, but it's like your insides. Yeah. I'm trying to think of a word that you know like that, but it's your insides, your innermost parts. Okay. But by the way, that's the word beten versus that's your stomach versus your womb, if you will. There's a word for the woman's insides. This is everyone's insides. Okay. All righty. Let's continue then in chapter 21.
Like channeled water is the mind of the king in the Lord's hand. He directs it to whatever he wishes. All the ways of a man seem right to him, but the Lord probes the mind. To do what is right and just is more desired by the Lord than sacrifice. Haughty looks, a proud heart, the tillage of the wicked is sinful. The plans of the diligent make only for gain. All rash haste makes only for loss. Treasures acquired by a lying tongue are like driven vapor heading for extinction. The violence of the wicked sweeps them away, for they refuse to act justly. The way of a man may be tortuous and strange, though his actions are blameless and proper. Dwelling in the corner of a roof is better than a contentious wife in a spacious house. The desire of the wicked is set upon evil. His fellow man finds no favor in his eyes. When a scoffer is punished, the simple man is edified. When a wise man is taught, he gains insight. The righteous one observes the house of the wicked man. He subverts the wicked to their ruin. Who stops his ears at the cry of the wretched, he too will call and not be answered. A gift in secret subdues anger. A present in private, fierce rage. Justice done is a joy to the righteous, to evildoers, ruination. A man who strays from the path of prudence will rest in the company of ghosts. He who loves pleasure comes to want. He who loves wine and oil does not grow rich. The wicked are the ransom of the righteous. The traitor comes in place of the upright. It is better to live in the desert than with a contentious, vexatious wife. Precious treasure and oil are in the house of the wise man, and a fool of a man will run through them. He who strives to do good and kind deeds attains life, success, and honor. One wise man prevailed over a city of warriors and brought down its mighty stronghold. He who guards his mouth and tongue guards himself from trouble. The proud, insolent man, scoffer is his name, acts in a frenzy of insolence. The craving of a lazy man kills him, for his hands refuse to work. All day long he is seized with craving, while the righteous man gives without stint. The sacrifice of the wicked man is an abomination, the more so as he offers it in depravity. A false witness is doomed, but one who really heard will testify with success. The wicked man is brazen-faced. The upright man discerns his course. No wisdom, no prudence, and no counsel can prevail against the Lord. The horse is readied for the day of battle, but victory comes from the Lord.
Wow. So again, a lot of the lines here again are go together. They're not this one good, that one bad. These are go together. These are go together lines. They're lines that reinforce one. One reinforces the other. Reinforcement lines. So that is the style of this. But again, some of the same ideas that we've already read. Being wise and thinking about stuff, and again having a wife that's two versions of this in this chapter, right? Better live in the desert than with a wife who's a problem. And then the other line, of course, is dwelling in the corner of a roof is better than living with a contentious woman and a wife in a big house. So it's better to live in a tiny little corner of a house than in a big house with somebody who's not your friend. So there's two versions of that in this one chapter. So again, it seems like there may be kind of different versions of, two different writers wrote something like this. But this line here in particular is kind of getting to what I said is one of the themes of this book, or one of the I don't say a theme, it's not a theme of the book, but it is definitely there all along, which is that this is not about religious behavior. It is about ethical behavior, to do what is right and just, to do tzedakah and mishpat, which again could be translated as also to do what you're supposed to do by law. It's not just morality, it's ethical behavior, which is like, you do it because it's the law, because we're supposed to do it. You're following the rules of the community. As a matter of fact, again, we usually translate tzedakah as justice, but mishpat, we usually translate it as, what's legal, what's there. What is the King James? How does the King James translate 3? Justice and judgment. Well, there it definitely uses, I don't know about using the word deen, but mishpat has an understanding of this is the law. I wouldn't say judgment, but doing what's lawful, doing what's righteous, doing what's good, and doing what's legal. I say being moral and being ethical is more important to God than your sacrifice, which in those days was the religious obligations like prayer. God cares more for the way you behave, the way you treat people, and the way you follow the rules than by the sacrifices that you offer. This clearly was not written by a priest. Or if it was written by a priest, it's written by a priest who cares about your moral and ethical behavior and not about your priestly obligations. Not good for business to write this, right? So there's a real understanding here that moral and ethical behavior is important, and legal behavior. You say moral and ethical, but also legal behavior, because mishpat definitely is legal. And to some extent, tzedakah is also legal. It's not like we usually say it's just, but it's also like it's just because that's what you have to do. That's why we don't like to use the word charity for tzedakah. We don't say tzedakah is our charity. It's our legal obligation to do it. It's what we're supposed to do. We're supposed to be in this world of doing tzedakah, not do it because we care to do it, which is the word charity, caritas, as we've talked about before, but because you're supposed to do it. So that's why justice is what we usually use for the word tzedek. Anybody else have any things that they want to point out that stuck with them? This is an interesting line too. The way of a man may be tortuous and strange. The word zar means unfamiliar or strange. Not a bad word, bad translation for it. I don't think they had the word necessarily torturous for verse 8 in King James. How do they translate it? What? Froward. Rosemary, what do you think of that word froward? Not forward, but froward.
A froward is kind of sort of out there in a bad way.
Yeah. The Hebrew, interestingly, Hafkafka is, they translate as torturous. I think that's maybe a little too extreme.
Would you say twisted?
Yeah, that would be the way I would do it. Twisted or
so
literally.
are they saying it may look very, somebody's ways may look very odd to you, but his actions make it okay. Or are they not?
It could be. It could also translate it because hafach also means upside down,
Yeah.
not just, it means turned over.
Or
And
are they saying, he's got a bad heart even though he doesn't act like
no,
that?
I would actually say, I would translate it more along the lines of the way that the guy gets from point A to point B is not easy.
Mm.
And it might actually be the reason they said torturous is because it's tortuous, is because it's hard on you. The implication of it being strange, which seems to be like, well, he's weird. I think it's more like difficult or foreign, like unknown to you. I would mean, I like the understanding that you're not doing things that are, they're not the path you're following is a strange path and is a difficult path, but it can also still be blameless and proper. Don't judge the path that the person had to get there as an indication that it wasn't blameless and proper. So, because sometimes we see somebody have a real difficult life. This is what I understand it is. I think it is. I think it really means this. I'm not just saying this, but I think because it is a good lesson if it is what it's saying. When you see somebody's life and you see how upside down it was, right? It's very easy for us to say, well, they deserved it. Of course, they must have been doing bad stuff. You look at the path they took through life, and you go, well, that was a bad path. That was a bad direction that guy went. But you can't look at that and go, well, he deserved it. No, it could be that he was blameless and proper and did everything he was supposed to do. It's not the way his path was. His life was hard. That's the way I read it. I think that's the intention of it. Is you don't look at somebody and go, well, I went in a weird direction. It went in a weird direction sometimes because the person got dealt a really bad hand. I mean, sometimes their actions, they might have deserved. I mean, if a person goes to prison and then turns their life around, they might have deserved to go to prison in the first place. But we're really talking about somebody who, maybe fell on really hard times, had a really hard time. Maybe they were homeless. I don't know. But because they're homeless doesn't mean that they were bad people. They could be blameless and proper in their behavior. Yashar means straight, that they were doing good things. They were doing upright things, but their life didn't reflect that. That's the way I understand it. I think it's an important idea too. And it's one that I try to live by, which is I'm not judging people by the path that they took and saying, well, there must be bad people. It's easy to do that. And people do that all the time. They look at somebody's life and they go, oh, that's really, and we do that with women all the time. We say, oh, woman's a this or that. Look at a woman who said, oh, she had bad decisions. Sometimes she didn't really have any decisions. She had no choice. So it's one of the things that kind of take away from that. Anything else? Anybody else have any comments about chapter 21? Because then we'll probably finish up with chapter 22. Yeah, probably 2 more weeks, I think. The last couple of chapters are kind of long. Obviously, chapter 31, Eshachayil, is very long, but I don't know. I'm not exactly sure. It's going to be close. But let's look at chapter 22 then, and see if we can take out any great lines from here. I know you'll find one right away, so we'll read through this chapter.
Repute is preferable to great wealth. Grace is better than silver and gold. Rich man and poor man meet. The Lord made them both. The shrewd man saw trouble and took cover. The simple kept going and paid the penalty. The effect of humility is fear of the Lord, wealth, honor, and life. Thorns and snares are in the path of the crooked. He who values his life will keep far from them. Train a lad in the way he ought to go. He will not swerve from it, even in old age. The rich rule the poor, and the borrower is a slave to the lender. He who sows injustice shall reap misfortune. His rod of wrath shall fail. The generous man is blessed, for he gives of his bread to the poor. Expel the scoffer, and contention departs. Quarrel and contumely cease. A pure-hearted friend, his speech is gracious. He has the king for his companion. The eyes of the Lord watch the wise man. He subverts the words of the treacherous. The lazy man says, there is a lion in the street. I shall be killed if I step outside. The mouth of a forbidden woman is a deep pit. He who is doomed by the Lord falls into it. If folly settles in the heart of a lad, the rod of discipline will remove it. To profit by withholding what is due to the poor is like making gifts to the rich, pure loss. Incline your ear and listen to the words of the sages. Pay attention to my wisdom. It is good that you store them inside you, and that all of them be constantly on your lips, that you may put your trust in the Lord. I let you know today, yes, you. Indeed, I wrote it down for you, a threefold law, wise counsel, to let you know truly reliable words, that you may give a faithful reply to him who sent you. Do not rob the wretched because he is wretched. Do not crush the poor man in the gate, for the Lord will take up their cause and despoil those who despoil them of life. Do not associate with an irascible man, or go about with one who is hot-tempered, lest you learn his ways and find yourself ensnared. Do not be one of those who give their hand, who stand surety for debts, lest your bed be taken from under you when you have no money to pay. Do not remove the ancient boundary stone that your ancestors set up. See a man skilled at his work. He shall attend upon kings. He shall not attend upon obscure men.
Yep. Some of these lines, again, seem to be totally disconnected to the lines before. But some of them seem to go together, like these lines here. You know, this line, you know, these lines seem to be part of a longer proverb, if you will. Interestingly, it says here the meaning of Hebrew is uncertain. This line of shalashim, perhaps again a threefold proverb. The threefold proverb doesn't. I mean, it's a possibility, a threefold law. The problem is we don't have a threefold line here. There's not a threefold thing we can pull out of this. So again, that's why we're not exactly sure. But a lot of these lines, again, seem to go past one verse. They don't seem to be. I mean, these two lines here, 22 and 23, seem to go together. Do not rob the wretched because he is wretched. Do not crush the poor man in the gate, for the Lord will take up their cause and despoil those who despoil them of life. Those lines don't seem to be one-liners. They seem to be a couple of liners. The theme, of course, here is not to take advantage of people less fortunate than you. And there will be people less fortunate than you, always. And that's one of the interesting things that Judaism kind of teaches us from the Bible and from the Talmud, which is there always will be people who will be rich and always people who will be poor. How we live through that kind of world, though, will really dictate whether we've created justice in a decent society. Again, we read today, you give money to the poor, and it's God that's going to give it back. He'll owe you. God will owe you that money. This is not the prosperity gospel, my friends, because the prosperity gospel is you give it to the church or you give it to God and then God gives it back. This is different. This is you give it to the poor and then God gives it back. That's an interesting idea, right? Yeah, it's not. It's giving it to people who need it. But here's the line again that, to some extent, again, you get a really pithy version of it in Ben Franklin. Neither a borrower nor lender be. The rich rule the poor, and the borrower is a slave to the lender. This is true. And so whether people want to believe this or not, whether they want to live by this, there are consequences for, borrowing money. And there's a situation where people put themselves in a position of being subservient to the people that they have borrowed money from. You create a situation where you have now made yourself below the person that you owe money to. This is not encouraging that kind of behavior. It's not quite, you shouldn't lend money either. It doesn't say that. The borrower, neither a borrower nor lender. There's the lender. Here it's not to be it doesn't say don't be a lender. It says don't borrow. It's not encouraging people to borrow money, correct? So this is the takeaway from this. No, it's from Hamlet, right? But I thought so Hamlet said it before Ben Franklin said it. I think Ben Franklin said it too. A line from the play by Hamlet, it's Polonius who says it. So there I expect Dr. Moose to have shared that with me. Yes, thank you, Floyd. That was not Ben Franklin said it, but I want to see if he said it too. But think about that, right? That's a father speaking to a son, very much like this, very much like what we have here, which is this style. Yeah, it's Polonius who says it again, as Floyd said. It's Polonius who says it, his hot-headed son Laertes. Neither borrower nor lender be. So
he that goes a borrowing goes a sorrowing is what Ben Franklin said.
That's the Franklin one? Say it again, Rosemary.
He that goes a borrowing goes a sorrowing.
Yeah, that's the Ben Franklin version. They're both good. This is the biblical version. So putting it in and again, it's not, I guess he could even say, it doesn't say not to lend money at all. It's not here. It's just don't borrow money.
It goes on to say that the lender who lends to him will be in trouble when he goes to get it again.
Yeah.
Here it is. If you would know the value of money, go and try to borrow some. For he that goes a borrowing goes a sorrowing, as poor Richard says, and indeed so does he that lends to such people when he goes to get it in again.
Yeah. So yeah, it follows the Polonius, makes it a little bit longer. Yeah, the Bible doesn't really caution it so much of don't be the lender, but it also kind of encourages people.
It kind of says, don't stand surety. So
correct, and that's what we have.
Don't be a cosigner.
Exactly, and that's what's in the Torah, and then what we have here in Proverbs a few times or different times is this kind of idea. The generous man is blessed, for he gives of his bread to the poor. So when we have an opportunity to help someone, we don't necessarily ask for anything back. That's why the line before that we read, which was God will make someone whole, is that you don't necessarily don't give money to the poor expecting them to give it back to you. which is not alone, right? It's not alone. It's giving it to them. So that seems to be, again, something that it's here too. That's generosity, is not asking for it back. He gives it to them. It doesn't say he loans it to them. So, anybody else? I mean, again, get people who are scoffers get them out of your group. Get them away. Get them off the board if they're scoffers. I don't think we have necessarily time to do 23. I wasn't sure whether we would get to 23 today. Which verse? Verse 6. Mary's grandmother's verse that she lived by, she said she was her favorite, was train a lad in the way he should go, and he will not swerve from it even in old age. Yeah. How did she live by that? It was her cross stitch on her wall, Mary said. Yeah, these are one-liners that oftentimes, when we talk about lines in Proverbs that people keep on a sign, or it could be on a bumper sticker. These are the lines, right? These are the kind of lines we get to. So train a lad early, right? And he will, a nar, a young person, and that's the way they'll go, even when they're yezakein, when they're older, when they're elders. They'll never forget it. But look, again, the effect of humility is fear of the Lord, wealth, honor, and life. There's a consequence to having that kind of humility, right? Which is not that you're a loser because you have humility, but that you actually have all of these wonderful things: wealth, honor, and life, which, if you will, would be the trifecta in Judaism. I guess health would be up there too, but they don't talk a lot about physical health, maybe because they really could do very little for it. But it's you could die of a tooth abscess. So, but these other things, wealth, honor, and life, those are definitely the trifecta from the biblical standpoint. And I guess life implies that you had health because you got through to life, right? But in those days, if you got sick, you pretty much died. So I guess they went hand in hand. They were contingent on each other. Rich man and poor man meet. The Lord made them both. Another line that maybe isn't on a pillow, but is a great thing to remind yourself. It's not like these people are different people who are not as wealthy as you, or even the people who are as wealthy. We're all the same. God created us all. It's not like there's one kind of person and another kind of person that were created by God to be rich or poor. God made them all. They're all created by God. One wasn't created by God and the other one was created by something else. They're all God's. We're all God's children, right? We're all created by God. And again, what really matters at the end is not great wealth, but repute, which is another way of saying, having clearly, made good decisions and living a reputable life, and grace, which is chen. That's more important than our monetary gain as being grace, as being chen, which it's weird. We think of grace being like, ballet dancers, graceful, but really means grace is that kind of goodness that comes from inside, that's not contingent on anything else. It's, it's loving somebody with grace, with acceptance, and with nothing necessarily expected in exchange. It's a difficult word to translate, but I've heard many a sermon about it. Specifically, actually, I usually hear Christians talking about grace, but it's obviously a very important Hebrew word. And it's a Hebrew word. It's the root for the name Hannah, or Anna. It's the root for the name Yochanan, John, God's grace. any of those words that have chen in them, they are very important in Judaism. This idea of grace, of having something that we don't. It's a divine gift, right? It really is a gift without, again, without condition. So, yeah, I don't know if anyone else had any lines that stuck out, but hopefully they're lines that you'll take with you. They're not all easy, obviously. They're not simple, but they're they're definitely important lines to take with you, and some very beautiful lines that you can put in your heart. And every chapter, every chapter has one or two that definitely stand out. Again, some of them are kind of repetitive. By the way, this one is odd because we haven't read a lot about this kind of stuff, which is legal, definitely legal, but do not remove an ancient boundary stone that your ancestors set up, which it definitely is in the Bible. There's many times where it talks about not changing boundaries of people's properties and tribal lands, but this understanding that, there are ways that have been set before you that are important for you to continue to follow, probably literally, physically, but also spiritually too. There are boundaries that we've set. I think that people who've read this over time in Judaism have said, our ancestors knew better about some things, and those ancient boundary stones are not necessarily just property lines, if you will. They're spiritual and behavioral boundaries that were our ancestors set up that help keep us safe. So, yeah. So next week we will continue with chapter 23. I don't think we're going to finish everything because it finishes in chapter 31. And there's several chapters that we're going to, and again, they're 30, 35 verses each. So you figure we're reading about 100 verses each time. But yes, we'll finish probably in 2 weeks in Proverbs. And then we're going to move into the book of Job. And again, to tell people as we go into the book of Job, we're moving into a different type of literature. It's still wisdom literature, considered wisdom literature by the people who break up biblical books by their style, but it is definitely not lines like we have here of an eclectic literature where collections of sayings. Job is a story, is a narrative, but more importantly, or more, at least comprehensively, if we look at it, Job is a philosophical explanation of life, not one person's life, but every person's life. And it's a philosophical book more than it is ethical teachings. So it's definitely going to be read differently than the way we've been reading it. But if anyone wants to, I don't definitely not say get a jump on it, because it's a difficult book to read in the best of circumstances, even with some of the teachers and some of the extra stuff that I'll be bringing in. Most people focus on the setup of the story, because it's one of the few places in the Bible where we ever hear the name Satan or Satan, the adversary. So a lot of people focus on that. But it is interesting that it's really not what it's about, and it's about life and about why things happen. If there's sense to the things that happen, and there have been a lot of other versions of Job that have been done. One of my favorites was one of the last books of. Some people say the greatest science fiction writer of all times, but he's definitely up there in the pantheon. Isaac Asimov, Robert Heinlein. He wrote a book called Job, A Comedy of Justice, and he wrote it in '84. And he died a couple of years later, and yeah, he died 4 years later. I think it was his last book, or it was one of his last books. and it's a Job version that he kind of takes to an American version of Job. So yeah, it's an interesting reflection on life. So we'll be doing that coming up. Like I said, I definitely would read Job first, the original, before you read some of the other versions of Job. But yeah, that's what we'll be reading in a couple weeks. We'll be jumping into there. So yeah, we will see you in the coming days, hopefully. And these are also other versions of Job that you can check out. There's a play that Neil Simon wrote, actually called God's Favorite. Uh, and there's another
Didn't the
version
Coen
of
brothers
Job.
do something?
What was that?
The Coen brothers one?
Yes. Which they didn't even list here, which I think is kind of
It's odd
interesting.
that's why I was going, where's that?
A Serious Man.
Yes.
And I would definitely recommend seeing that after we read Job. But Serious Man is one of my favorite Coen brother movies. It's not an easy movie to see, but it's the most Minnesota movie of these guys, because it took place in St. Louis Park, and for people who know Minnesota, it's definitely
Yes.
it's also the most rabbinical. There's a lot of things about that movie that are freaky in my life, but
Yes.
yeah, some weird coincidences. But definitely, if you want to read or start working on some Job related material before or after, this is definitely one you're gonna want to see. Funnily enough, they don't talk too much about it on this air. It says there are some critics, including Roger Ebert, commenting on the link between the book of Job. Anyways, I think it's definitely something you should see after we read it. All right, folks, take care. We will see you soon. And thanks again, Rosemary, for
Thank you. Happy New
taking
Year
us through
again, everybody.
today. Take care, everybody. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.